Nintendo's DS Lite is one of the best handheld consoles ever made, but over the years it's become one that's prone to a number of problems, with power issues ranking high on that list. Fortunately, there's a relatively straightforward sequence of troubleshooting that you can follow to diagnose any faults and hopefully get your console back up and running quickly and cheaply. Hi and welcome back to the shed. I'm Joe Bleeps, and recently I've been building some Game Boy macro consoles like this one here, which involves using parts salvaged from a DS Lite to make a single screen handheld console that runs Game Boy Advance games. I found what seemed to be the perfect donor console here, with all the parts that would end up being discarded, such as the touchscreen, front faceplate and the hinge showing signs of wear or damage anyway, and nearly all the parts that I would need to keep appearing to be usable. However, I had an issue with charging the battery and getting power to the console. The DS Lite has an internal 3.7 volt lithium ion rechargeable battery that charges when you plug in an adapter, at which point an orange LED will illuminate here until charging has completed. In the case of this console, when the charger was plugged in, the LED would briefly light up and then promptly switch off. This is a fairly common thing with old DS Lite consoles, and there's a variety of reasons as to why it might be happening, but thankfully there's a fairly straightforward sequence of troubleshooting steps that you can follow here to get your console up and running again in no time. Let's take a look. To diagnose most of the possible power issues, you'll need to remove the motherboard from the console. You'll only need to dismantle the lower half of the console for this, and you'll need the help of a small Phillips head screwdriver, a small tri-wing screwdriver, and a spudger like this one here. In addition to this, you may well end up needing a multimeter with a continuity checker, and it's also likely you'll need to do some soldering. If that's the case, you'll need to remove and replace one or more of the components, so some flux, a solder sucker, and maybe some desoldering wick would be quite helpful here. If you do have a heat gun and some Kapton tape, then that will also make the job easier, but it isn't essential. So before diving in with a multimeter and a soldering iron, there's a few simple checks you can do first, starting off a gradual process of elimination to try and find your fault. The first step in the list of troubleshooting is to try a different charger. It could just be as simple as that. Your charger might not be working properly. If the same thing happens with a different charger, then your next check will be the battery itself, which could also be faulty. So I borrowed the battery from a different console that was taking charge no problem and tried that in my console, and again the same thing happened when the charger was plugged in. So this let me know that my battery was likely to be fine and that it wasn't the root of the problem. Next, inspect the two contacts inside the battery compartment for corrosion. This is rare, but if there is any corrosion on the two contacts, then some white vinegar would probably help remove that and allow you to try your battery again. I did just that in a recent Game Boy printer video, so if that's your problem, I'll leave a link to that one up here. In my case, the contacts were actually really clean, so I knew I would need to open the console further. You'll find a number of different size screws in the DS Lite, and it's important to make sure they all go back in the right place when you're reassembling, so pay attention to which screw goes where. Firstly, you'll use the pointed end of the spudger to remove the two rubber feet near the hinge. Just dig in from the corner and they'll pop off fairly easily. Their self-adhesive pads stay sticky, so put them somewhere safe because you'll be putting them back on the console after reassembly. Under these pads, you'll find two gold-coloured Phillips head screws. Take those out first. Then there's a short Phillips screw on the top right corner inside the battery compartment. You'll need to make sure you don't put a long screw in there when you're reassembling, as it will punch through the faceplate and ruin your console. Don't ask me how I know. Then remove the screws from the other three corners with a tri-wing screwdriver. You'll notice that these are a bit longer. Sometimes they're reluctant to come out of the shell itself, but you can always remove them afterwards. There's also a little black tri-wing screw inside slot 1, so don't miss that. With all your screws removed, it's time to remove the rear shell. There's some clips holding it in place. You'll need to gently pull it apart near a shoulder button and then run the flat end of your spudger around the edge from there. You'll feel the clips come undone one by one, allowing you to easily remove the rear shell afterwards. Next, you can remove the shoulder buttons. Now they'll come with a hinge pin and a small spring, which is likely to ping round and hit your fingers when you remove them, so don't let that catch you by surprise. Do your best to keep the assembly of the pin and the spring together inside the button. If they do separate, it's not a big deal, but do make sure to keep each spring with the correct button. The springs are actually specific to the left or right, and it'll cause you problems if you get those mixed up. More on that later. With the motherboard now exposed, you can continue your troubleshooting. Nearby to the power socket are two tiny fuses labelled F1 near the charging port and F2 below the battery connector. They'll need checking, as well as the little block-shaped component labelled EM10 just below the charging port, which is actually a charge regulator with a metal contact on each corner. When I opened mine, there was a bit of a mess inside and possible corrosion around the F2 area. I used isopropyl alcohol on a cotton bud to spread it across the affected area, let it soak in a little, and then used a toothbrush to gently dislodge any debris from the surface. It cleaned up well and made it easier to access and check the fuse and inspect for damage. To check the fuses and the charge regulator, you'll need a multimeter with a continuity check. When there's a connection between the two probes, you'll hear a beep, and if you place a probe on either side of each fuse and it beeps, that means the fuse is still functional. If you don't hear a beep, make sure you are definitely touching the metal. There's sometimes a layer of flux or similar that prevents a good contact that may need scraping away. If F1 and F2 are found to be working, your next check is EM10. Do the same as the fuses, but you're checking for continuity from side to side, lower left to right, and then upper left to right. If this seems to be okay, your most likely issue is the charging port itself, which will need replacing if at fault. If it turns out that any of your F1, F2, EM10 are faulty, then you can buy replacement parts from Z Labs, as well as the charging socket if you need one of those. I'll leave links in the description. So, looking at my charging port, there are some telltale spots of rust near the connectors, so a replacement seemed to be the best chance of revival. To move ahead from here, you need to completely remove the motherboard from the shell, which starts with removing another two short crosshead screws. I did a quick check with the battery to see if the cleanup had fixed my problem. You can do this without reassembling. Just hold the battery firmly against the contacts and plug in the charger. Alas, in this case, it didn't fix my problem, but cleaning up the mess had definitely made it easier to check the fuses. Before moving any further, it's worth taking some photos for reference when you're reassembling, particularly the routing of the black and white wires. Disconnect the black wire to the left of the DS slot by lifting it with the spudger. It should unclip easily, and it'll need careful unthreading from underneath the DS slot. This can be tricky, and it might need a gentle wiggle if it catches on anything. Now you can remove the Wi-Fi module, which is held in place with a sticky pad, and will come away with a gentle pull to remove it from its socket. Now this module contains the BIOS for the whole console, and it won't work without it, so be sure not to lose that. Now look for the small ribbon that folds around the top of the motherboard that connects your touchscreen's digitizer. Carefully use your spudger to lift up the catch on the socket, and the ribbon should come out quite easily. Next, remove the motherboard, but keep the lower screen supported by opening the hinge and pushing on the screen itself. This will lift the motherboard out, and you can flip it over to access the bracket for the upper screen's ribbon. Again, use the flat end of the spudger to lift the catch and carefully remove the ribbon. Finally, lift off the white wire that's exposed through the separation, and your motherboard will be free from the shell. Remove the lower screen by lifting the catch on the bracket again. You've already disconnected the digitizer, so it should all come away easily, leaving the motherboard completely exposed. You'll be able to see the underside of the charging port now, where there are 5 solder points that will need to be removed. I started with my soldering iron and solder sucker. Just heat up the solder point and suck it up when it's molten, remembering to clear out the sucker intermittently because it will fill up with solder. I made 2 passes with the solder sucker, which removed almost all the solder, and then decided to use my heat gun to finish and avoid applying any pressure that might rip the solder pads from the board. I masked off the surrounding areas with capped on tape, heated all the solder points, and waited until the bracket dropped out of the motherboard. There may be a little solder left behind. If it's being awkward, add more solder, and then you'll have a bigger blob that'll merge with the smaller bits, and it's just easier to suck the whole lot up. Remove any tape and put the faulty port out of the way. Now you'll need a replacement charge port available from Z Labs, or you could do what I did, which is repeat the process to remove a working power socket from a scrap motherboard with other faults. Soldering iron and solder sucker first, then the heat gun to remove it fully. I didn't need the tape this time, as I didn't need to protect the rest of the board. I then clamped up my good motherboard, carefully pushed the working charge port into the motherboard itself, making sure I had it on the right side of the board, which is next to the DS slot. Don't make that mistake. I put some flux on the area I wanted to solder, and then used my soldering iron to heat each pin, adding some solder and giving it time to flow before removing the iron each time. To finish, I used a cotton bud with some alcohol to clean up any residue from the flux. I used my multimeter on each point to make sure I had a good connection. There's one pin linked to V in, which is the voltage, and the rest are all ground. I did a quick test by holding the battery in place and inserting the charger. The orange LED came on and stayed on, so everything seemed to be working. As I'm using this board for a macro project, I didn't really need to reassemble, but for the purposes of this video, I figured I may as well explain the reassembly process, as it can get tricky if you haven't done it before. First, reattach the lower screen with the big ribbon first going into the socket and folding the clamp down, then the digitizer on the back with the same process. It's delicate, so be careful. Then plug your Wi-Fi module back in place. I attach the ribbon to the top screen next, but at this point I should really have put all the buttons and silicon pads back in place. I'd advise that now rather than what I did. After that, route your white wire along the little channel in the faceplate and drop your motherboard on top to hold it in place. It should come out from under the motherboard near where the digitizer ribbon goes in, and then clip onto the circular connector on top. Now you'll need to feed the black wire under the motherboard, which is pretty much the worst part of the process. Sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll just go straight underneath and appear on the other side. This was not one of those times. Stay patient, keep trying, and eventually you'll be able to grab it with some tweezers and thread it right through. After which you'll connect it to the clip on the Wi-Fi module and tidy up the routing near the charging port to get all the wire out of the way. So this was when I put my buttons in by lifting the motherboard up and out of the way, putting the buttons in place, securing the silicon membranes, and then carefully lowering the motherboard back down. I did have to redo some of the wire routing after this, so as I said, it's best to do the buttons first. With the motherboard in place, put the two short Phillips screws back in where the two white circles are indicated on the motherboard. And now for your shoulder buttons. For each one, align the spring in the gap between the two plastic tabs, and then the pin will thread through. If you hold it with a little tension on the spring, it should hold the assembly together while you put the buttons in place. If you look at the assembly, the bit of spring that sticks out should be at the bottom. If you've got the springs on the wrong side, then it'll actually be at the top and it'll keep coming unclipped, which is incredibly annoying but easily avoided. I've seen loads of guides where people don't do this and then they complain that it won't hold in place, but they're just doing it wrong. Use tweezers or a spudger to pull the spring around and then locate it in the little gap in the plastic, and then both your L and R buttons should happily sit in place while you put the rear shell on. Make sure the volume slider is in position on the lower setting on the shell and the motherboard, and that the power switch is in the off position on the shell. Carefully lower the rear shell in place, first engaging the volume slider, then the power switch, and then the top edge where you might need to wiggle L and R for the pins to engage, and then you'll just feel it all pop together. Check that the volume slider works, and then the power button springs back when it's slid up. It is easy to pinch either of these two in the wrong place, which can easily break the components, so it is worth taking some time over this. Then you have your screws to go back in. 3 longer tri-wing screws on the lower left and right and upper left corners, and then that small Phillips screw in the upper right inside the battery compartment. Then you've got your small black tri-wing screw in the DS slot, and finally those 2 gold Phillips screws in the upper left and right, and you're all back together. Time to give a final test and see if it charges. If all goes according to plan, you'll get the same results as me here. If it works, you can stick those rubber feet back on. I left mine off because I was going to be taking it apart anyway for my next project. It feels good to bring a console back from the dead. Always so satisfying and not as difficult as you might expect. After further inspection of the console itself, both the cartridge slots and all the controls were working, and the top screen was dead, so it's actually a perfect candidate for my next macro console I wanted to build, and I'll be sharing that one with you in an upcoming video. If you're carrying out any mods or repairs yourself, I'd appreciate it if you use the affiliate links I've left in the description for Z Labs. There's one on the main page, as well as some individual links for some of the parts I mentioned in the video. Now, if you use these links, it won't cost you any extra, but I'll get a little commission that helps support this channel, so that support really is appreciated. As a nice little bonus, you can get 5% off your order if you use the code JOEBLEEPS at the checkout. If you've watched this far, thank you. I'm always keen to chat in the comments if there's anything you wanted to ask, and if you'd like to see more like this, be sure to subscribe and sign up for notifications. Let's keep this little channel growing. This is Joe Bleeps signing off from the shed. If you want to keep watching, there should be some more videos popping up for you here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.